Hi, and welcome to this talk called A Touch of Vitriol, the short story magic of Aleister Crowley. I hope you will find it interesting and entertaining. Although Aleister Crowley will always be remembered mainly for his syncretistic efforts in the world of 20th century occultism, bringing the old into the new and the East into the West and the speculative into the empirical of sorts, etc., let's not forget that he was also an author of much poetry and fiction. And when not promoting himself as a prophet of a new and in many ways literally self-concocted religion, he wanted it stressed that he was one of the greatest poets stemming from the British Isles ever. Be that as it may, but write a lot he did. Crowley understood the power of the written word and of its preservation in lasting editions. And although his occultism was in great part circling around the creative potential of semination, in a similar way as his contemporaries Remy de Gourmont and Ezra Pound, he also understood very well the magic of dissemination. Writing voluminously, he also made sure his works were published in nice editions that would last and effect change in the future. And here we are, talking about it in the future. Crowley was an experimentalist in every way, trying things out, integrating the experiences, and processing it all for future expressions in various forms. His mind seems to have been constantly at work to evaluate and weigh what could be used in his own artistic pursuits. Relationships, experiences of meditations and rituals, travels, drugs, sex, and what have you, were all mixed in Crowley's creative cauldron, consciously or not. The short story The Vitriol Thrower is symptomatic of this in many ways. Written in Paris in the early 1900s and published in the Equinox, Volume 1, Number 9 in 1913, it's a bagatelle about a Scotsman called Clement Seton and his relationship to two women, a sad widow called Sylvie and a celebrated femme fatale called Mirabelle. Clement is initially obsessed and drained by his mistress Mirabelle, although warned by the caretaking motherly Miss Aitken and his new acquaintance Sylvie, whose husband Sergius committed suicide after having been involved with Mirabelle. After a few pensive moments at a cemetery together with Sylvie, Seton realizes, quote, "But who am I to waste these months? I have said, easy to write the curtain raiser, but few who can pen 5 pungent acts. Yet why should I wait? Why not make drama myself? Tragedy, no, for I am God and must laugh at everything." End quote. And in her hatred of Mirabelle, Sylvie says that she wants to kill her, and Clement Seton whispers something secret in her ear. Sylvie then throws vitriolic acid in Mirabelle's face on the street. Beauty thus becomes ugliness, and the Scarlet Woman as goddess is violently demoted to mere humble humanity. Seton carries Mirabelle back to her studio and then lives with her and the motherly Aitken for a year, nursing her back to health by making her pregnant. Mirabelle gives birth while poor Sylvie's dying, so Seton temporarily moves in with her. Quote, "I have studied her enough," he says of the former femme fatale, who is now busy with his offspring. He also confesses to Miss Aitken that the vitriol attack was his idea. Aitken then tells Mirabelle, who in her newly found subdued love says, quote, "I leap with joy breeding this child to him," end quote. And when Sylvie is eventually dead, Seton returns to Mirabelle, this time brotherly. The narrator of the story concludes quite cryptically, quote, "The child was 12 years old last week. In him we see the seeds of miraculous thoughts, things to transcend all limitations, mortal and immortal, common to man. the overman is surely come. In the second generation is he established." End quote. This short story is dedicated to a woman called Kathleen Scott, which should be a kind of door opener in our literary mystery play. When Crowley knew her in Paris in the early 1900s, she was the sculptor Kathleen Bruce, and very much a part of a bohemian and artistic crowd of bisexual expat experimentalists. Crowley and Bruce were lovers for a while, and she was the one who introduced Crowley to Auguste Rodin, which led to the project Rodin in Rhyme. In his book Confessions, Crowley writes of Bruce, quote, "She was strangely seductive. Her brilliant beauty and wholesome Highland flamboyance were complicated with a sinister perversity. She took delight in getting married men away from their wives and the like. Love had no savor for her unless she was causing ruin or unhappiness to others. I was quite ignorant of her intentions when she asked me to sit for her, but once in her studio she lost no time, and the Black Mass, the Adepts, and the Vampire describe with ruthless accuracy our relations. She initiated me into the torturing pleasures of algolagny on the spiritual plane. She showed me how to intensify passion by self-restraint. The formula is entirely analogous to the physical formula of the Arabs. She made me wonder, in fact, if the secret of Puritanism was not to heighten the intensity of love by putting obstacles in its way." End quote. Clement Seton echoes these sentiments in many places in the story, such as, quote, "You only lift your finger and they die for you," and "You have taken down your hair, it flows over your breasts like a river of hell," end quote. This fluidity of progenitor-protagonist identities becomes temporarily crystal clear when Seton's sense of, quote, truth urged him to sing a song he had made of Mirabelle. "The world for a whore, the sky for a harlot, all life at your door for a woman of scarlet. A bitter exchange, a bad bargain to strike. It may seem to you strange. The fact is, I like it. You offer me gold, place, power, and pleasure, to have and to hold, inexhaustible treasure. I'll give it and more in this planet of boredom for a girl that's a whore and is proud of her whoredom." End quote. Now, this is actually Crowley's own pre-Babylonic fantasy ode, originally published in Volume 2 of his collected works, published in 1906. So although the carefree god who laughs and wants to create drama is a bit of a masochist, in his fiction at least he wins the battle of the sexes by literal insemination, to which the courtesan adapts after being demoted by vitriolic acid. It's a strange twist of compensatory sadism on the author's part, I'd say. A dark kind of distillation from someone who makes a quasi-religious virtue out of a psychosexual necessity. And this final sentence is interesting. Quote, "The overman is surely come, in the second generation is he established." End quote. This rings a Zarathustra bell, of course, as the overman is a more correct translation of Nietzsche's Übermensch than any kind of superman. There is only one overman here, or laughing god, Aleister Crowley, aka Clement Seton, set on taming the shrew that teases and diminishes him, thereby transcending his own masculine weaknesses and becoming an overman beyond good and evil. The second generation mentioned, whether a physical son in Seton's case or a new generation of Crowleyites in Crowley's, certainly constitutes the first step inherent in Zarathustra's famous cry of hubris, Ich liebe dich, o Ewigkeit, for I love you, O eternity. Clement Seton seems to be more strategic in this divine endeavor than Mirabelle herself, and thereby discarding pure passion as the incentive in favor of strategy, or so it might seem. This brings forth another contemporary voice, that of Irish socialist and anti-Christian playwright George Bernard Shaw, whose successful and light-hearted 1903 play Man and Superman contained his own ideas about eugenics and the importance of woman in the evolutionary process. These themes were apparently hovering diligently in the radical zeitgeist. Although influenced by Nietzsche a great deal, Shaw's socialism would have been shunned by Zarathustra's daddy. And Crowley, of course, didn't like to be outshone by anyone in British culture, neither successful Maugham nor successful Shaw, even though they were all pretty much on the same page philosophically. Crowley also enjoyed spewing compensatory vitriol on those who had more of anything, basically, but mostly when it came to recognition and acclaim. Quote, Bernard Shaw's attacks on religion and morality are taken as a matter of course. But when people like Ibsen, Nietzsche, and myself say the same things, we are held up to popular execration. End quote. But these disappointments rarely have to do with the quality of someone's writing or what is really being transmitted. It's not always the message, but more often the messenger that gets shot, although it can also go both ways. Certain people will always be lauded whatever they do or write. In our example of the vitriol thrower, this insight is referenced by the narrator, that is, more so by Crowley himself than the protagonist Seton. Quote, Artists hate artists, not for envy, but because there can be no companionship among the gods. Eternally silent in himself, a god sees all, knows all, yet nothing touches him. He can learn nothing from another such, while his study is mankind. End quote. Crowley knew how controversial he was in his flamboyance, and when it came to his public image in British culture, I think it's safe to say that he burnt those bridges early on. Taking a cue from Oscar Wilde in many ways, it's almost as if Crowley made a virtue out of necessity and carried on in the scandalous lane after his money was gone. Because at least infamy was better than no fame at all. In his introduction to Christopher Isherwood's translation of Baudelaire's intimate journals, W.H. Auden writes about the psychology of the Baudelairean dandy, and in many ways describing Aleister Crowley perfectly. Quote, The dandy, it will be seen, is like the hero of poetry, in that he requires certain gifts of fortune, such as money and leisure, and like the hero of philosophy, in that he must be endowed with the will to make himself into a dandy out of the corrupt nature into which he, like everyone else, is born. On the other hand, the dandy is neither a man of action nor a seeker after wisdom. His ambition is neither to be admired by men nor to know God, but simply to become subjectively conscious of being uniquely himself and unlike anyone else. He is, in fact, the religious hero turned upside down, that is, Lucifer, the rebel, the defiant one who asserts his freedom by disobeying all commands, whether given by God, society, or his own nature. The truly dandyish act is the acte gratuit, because only an act which is quite unnecessary, unmotivated by any given requiredness, can be an absolutely freely self-chosen act." End quote. Such as convincing a disgruntled widow to throw vitriolic acid in another woman's face, one wonders, and then laughing about it from the perspective of a god. We have to go no further than our chosen story to find an example of Crowley's own admiration for Baudelaire specifically. In the very beginning, Clement Seton states, quote, "I like to think that Baudelaire, brooding like an unquiet fiend above his carrion, may laugh, though it be but the laugh of hell at this my tale." End quote. Baudelaire himself seems wiser in his psychology in regard to the addictive features of feminine attraction. In the poem called Hymne à la beauté, Hymn to Beauty, he concludes, quote, "Moth-like around your flame, the transient turning, crackles and flames and cries, ah, heavenly doom! The quivering lover over his mistress yearning is but a dying man who woos his tomb." End quote. There are of course some interesting aspects in the very title itself. Sylvie is indeed a vitriol thrower quite literally, an act that disfigures and displaces her enemy. And slightly before the heinous act, Seton and Mirabel lie together and Seton says, quote, "I sacrifice the splendor of our passion to initiate you," end quote. Meaning, he poetically alludes to the act to the unknowing Mirabel, and that he has the apparent authority to do so. Not only is it an insight into Crowley's sadistic psyche, or at least his fictional protagonists, but also decidedly a cruel and vitriolic irony. And it's not far-fetched, I think, judging from Crowley's own accounts, to assume that the real vitriolicisms in this relationship stemmed from Kathleen Bruce towards Crowley. Hence a reversal of fortune in fiction with liberal interest added thereunto. Then of course there's the magical reference. Vitriol is also vitriol, the acronym for the Latin Visita interiora terra rectificando invenies occultum lapidem, meaning visit the interior ground and you will find the hidden stone, referring to the alchemical philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, etc. The very key to magic within Crowley's universe of traditional occultism. So what's being thrown at the femme fatale and sacred whore, Mirabel, is at the same time an encouragement to seek within. One would assume here within the womb, to find genuine happiness. Crowley lets Mirabel herself express it like this, as mentioned earlier. Quote, "I have had much joy of Clement. I leap with joy, breeding this child to him." End quote. And to further alienate contemporary feminists, Crowley lets Mirabel comment on Seton's returning to the other woman. Quote, "Let him go to Sylvie. It is a woman's part to see her husband go away on strange errands." End quote. What then about the nom de plume Mirabel itself? Knowing Crowley's punny versatility, we find a double whammy in the literal wordplay, Mirabel, Spanish-French in a mix for behold beauty. And, more interestingly, the masculine version of Mirabeau, as in Honoré Gabriel de Riquetti Mirabeau, the French aristocrat who was instrumental in the French Revolution, a philosopher of the Enlightenment, but usually more concerned with things sexual. He was constantly fighting someone or something in politics or in private, and was even sentenced to death at one point. And he once shared a prison cell with another hypersexual aristocrat by the name of Marquis de Sade, and they did not get along well together. Mirabeau's writings on sexual traits and perversions, mainly in his classic Erotica Biblion, written in the late 1770s while still imprisoned, caused a scandal even though it was printed privately. But to cause a scandal seems to have been the goal, anyway. The imprimatur states that the book was published in Rome at the Vatican Printing House. The legend of Mirabeau's works lived on to the extent that there was even an Erotica Biblion Society in London between 1898 and 1907, organized by a certain Leonard Smithers, who was also responsible for publishing Crowley's early erotica, Akeldama and White Stains, both in 1898. Incidentally, and highly relevant in this case, it was Akeldama that attracted the painter Gerald Kelly to Crowley and led to their friendship. And this, in turn, led to Crowley's marriage to Rose Kelly, Gerald's older sister, and onto their legendary Egyptian adventure that has been very, very, very influential in Thelemic circles. And, of course, to Crowley's frequenting Paris a lot, which was where Gerald Kelly was living, and where Kathleen Bruce was a real-life femme fatale who kept her men on a very short leash. And, as another side note of some importance, to Crowley being a welcome guest among Kelly's friends in Montparnasse, including the successful playwright and author W. Somerset Maugham, who did not take a liking to Crowley's boastful antics, as we can read in Maugham's famous novel The Magician from 1908. Gerald Kelly, on the other hand, did not like Kathleen Bruce, and especially not Crowley's lauding of her talents. Quote, "She was a pretentious creature and a very bad sculptress. She was not a pupil of Rodin. What a tawdry mind AC had. Everything had to be improved, that is, made more interesting. His home should have been Hollywood." End quote. Speaking of names, let's not forget Clement Seton himself. Clemency is the ability to show mercy, and Seton could very well be to be set on being clement, or, why not, just for the hell of it, the clemency of Satan. Here we drift into loose hermeneutic speculation, but that's essentially what Crowley's genius brings in so many ways. His expressions may not be the best, whatever that means, in the innate hypersubjectivity of Thelemic culture, but his mind at work is always fascinating as soon as you start scraping the hagiomanic hyperbole off the surface. It reveals not only a mind at work, but certainly the mind of a creative genius, who was perhaps even too versatile and volatile for his own good. The associative playfulness in pondering and writing and presenting it as something distinct, such as a poem, a short story, or a magical instruction, gradually became Crowley's forte. From having been a young romantic poet, very much stuck in the form of meters and poetic structures, he broke free and started to experiment with what we could call expanded expressions, texts that essentially makes us unsure of what they really are, in a way like the conceptual writing of today's literary art scenes. It's not stream of consciousness or automatic writing, but rather something that is coherent enough to keep you on the edge, attentive enough to keep you reading. This ambiguity fits well into the spiritual or occult context, which usually thrives on obfuscation and befuddlement, and I do believe that Crowley was consciously aware of this. As comparison, I'm thinking specifically of Zen koans, the strange riddles and mysterious challenges in very poetic form that are supposed to open the minds of the students, not by deductive or cognitive force, but rather by subjecting their rational processes to an intuitive flow. The initial confusion becomes the key, in a way, if one allows it to. One of the greatest 20th century Zen disseminators, D.T. Suzuki, wrote thus about this, quote, "The koan is within ourselves, and what the Zen master does is not more than to point out for us so that we can see it more plainly than before. When the koan is brought out of the unconscious to the field of consciousness, it is said to have been understood by us. To effect this awakening, the koan sometimes takes a dialectical form, but frequently assumes, superficially at least, an entirely nonsensical form. What is nonsensical indeed has a great deal of meaning and makes us penetrate the veil that exists as far as we stay on this side of relativity." End quote. The best example of this in Crowley's case is undoubtedly his Book of Lies, originally published in 1913. Under the umbrella of magical instruction, the short chapters are cryptic and filled with symbolic references. Quote, "Haggard am I, an hyena, I hunger and howl. Men think it laughter. Ha ha ha. There is nothing movable or immovable under the firmament of heaven on which I may write the symbols of the secret of my soul. Yea, though I were lowered by ropes into the utmost caverns and vaults of eternity, there is not word to express even the first whisper of the initiator in mine ear. Yea, I abhor birth, ululating lamentations of night. Agony, agony, the light within me breeds veils, the song within me dumbness. God, in what prism may any man analyze my light?" End quote. This inspired piece of writing would be great enough, and in many ways probably suffice to reach or affect people. But Crowley's apparent psychological dilemma was that he also needed to proselytize and preach, as though he were a prophet of sorts. So, for each brilliant piece of soulful writing in his Book of Lies, there is, on the facing page, an explanation that paradoxically confuses even more than it clears up. Quote, "In this chapter, the author, in a sort of raging eloquence, bewails his impotence to express himself, or to induce others to follow him to the light. In paragraph 1, he explains the sardonic laughter for which he is justly celebrated as being in reality the expression of this feeling." End quote. It is interesting to see this almost schizophrenic approach to not being able to leave one's own writing alone. The reasons could be many. One of insecurity, in that he wants to convey something in poetic or allegorical form, but is unsure of whether the recipient will get it. Another could be that text number 1 is a mere justification for preaching in text number 2 on the facing page, in an inspired frenzy, in this case about constructing a book called the Book of Lies. Yet another reason, perhaps the kindest, is that Crowley was very much aware that apparent exuberance or overkill can actually help some readers or students to see the proverbial light, and that this is very much a result of a passionate union of opposites, of transcending apparent dichotomies and distilling your own solution or interpretation. In many of the Eastern texts that were being made available in translation at this time, there were descriptions of the Bodhisattva who had returned to teach humans after he had himself reached the state of nirvana. Undoubtedly a figure or role that Crowley felt an affinity with. An old Zen master called Yoshu Yushin described this type thus, quote, "He is the one who is in the house and yet does not stay away from the road. He is the one who is on the road and yet does not stay away from the house. Is he an ordinary man or a great sage? No one can tell. Even the devil does not know where to locate him. Even the Buddha fails to manage him as he may desire. and when we try to point him out, he is no more there. He is on the other side of the mountain." End quote. In his short stories and fiction, in general, Crowley reaches no real literary peaks. He is rather at the foot of the mountain, or on the other side of it, as Yosho Yoshin suggests, looking up as an involuntary anti-Zarathustra in a way. What Crowley does have, though, is a great capacity to give his own auto-fiction a general form bordering on the banal, while still making sure it's filled with hidden meanings and double entendres, as well as trips, traps, and tropes. And this complexity, for the most part, leaks through in an enticing way that makes you feel, rather than understand, that there was more to the text in question than met the dull cogs of cogitation. And in our chosen short story, Crowley weaves a fascinating tale based on his own Parisian experiences, in particular his masochistic relationship with Kathleen Bruce, occult references, and a set of morals bordering on both surprisingly paradoxical morality and demeaning misogyny. Perhaps the dramatic bourgeois French literature of the time, à la Balzac, affected Crowley as much as the absinthe he ingested. We can ask ourselves, is this short story a mere intuitive literary reflection, a conceived cathartic ritual, albeit in apparently trivial form, or perhaps even a mystery created specifically for us here today? We will never know for sure, but we do gladly speculate forever. And perhaps that is the genuine signum of a laughing god as conceived by Clement Seton or Crowley himself. The last laugh is always on him. Thank you for being here and listening to my talk on Aleister Crowley's short story magic. Please also check out my other video lectures here at Vimeo, and if you want to support my work, please consider joining the Patreon I have together with my wife, artist and psychoanalyst Vanessa Sinclair. In the information text for this recording, you can also find many links of relevance that will take you to other expressions of my work. Again, thank you for being here, and I hope to see you soon again. Bye.